So the early Middle Ages marked actually the emergence of the daily divine office in the monastic manner that we actually know of it today, with the daily readings from the Psalms and other books of the Bible at Lauds and Vespers and so forth. So the Bible, of course, during this time is central to the devotional life of the monks. Now, reading the Bible wasn't, it's for theological interpretation, speculative research, it's for study, it's growing numbers of monasteries are there, and of course this is the center to everything. And the great Abbey of St. Victor in Paris distinguished itself as a center of both biblical mysticism and scholarship. And of course, no figure of St. Victor's Abbey was more distinguished than Hugh, hence Hugh of St. Victor. I know, right? So the name Hugh of St. Victor is actually somewhat obscure to most modern Catholics, partially because his career took place at just a bad time, right? If you want to be uber famous as a theologian, right? He's kind of in that no man's land. He's after the late patristic age, but before the scholastic age really got going. Sad to say, though, he was very influential and very devout. He just was never canonized. He is blessed. He hasn't been declared a doctor of the church. He wasn't part of a vibrant and influential religious order that could really promote his cause for canonization or more fully disseminate and promote his writings as the centuries passed. So he just kind of got left by the wayside, right? He's really kind of an underdog and underappreciated. And for lay Catholics, all but forgotten. Of course, specialists in the Middle Ages know about him well, as he was the one who took the first great strides to harmonize Western Christian tradition represented by the Fathers with the philosophy of Aristotle. So Hugh's project was the advancement of philosophy to aid in the understanding of revealed truth and to examine science and use science as a tool for approaching God. So he serves as a bridge figure, really, between the two greatest thinkers of Latin Christianity, Augustine and Aquinas. And in fact, he actually was named the Alter Augustinus, or the second Augustine. He actually produced his own Summa, Summas were relatively common. He was one of the first to produce a Summa, like we think of with Aquinas, and somewhat of a precursor to Thomas Aquinas' obviously much more famous one. So he presents all knowledge as an integrated whole intended to assist man in achieving his end. So this is the main idea of the Didascalicon, which is his surviving masterpiece. Now, it's been translated into English actually relatively recently, and it's surprisingly accessible to read. So if you do read it, you will notice that the early chapters actually concern grammar and logic and rhetoric. And then they go on to arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But it's supposed to be a book on biblical interpretation, so you kind of go, where do these things fit in? Well, okay, this is how Hugh thinks, right? This is taking everything. So grammar, logic, and rhetoric, of course, constitute the trivium. These are the fundamental things that you need to do. And after that, you go to the higher level, which is quadrivium, which is the four things, right? So natural science, so arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But you don't stop there, of course. Once you finish those, you got the building blocks, you got the natural ones, then you go on to theology. So all of those prepared you for the study of the sacred scripture. And so his knowledge is integrated, and the knowledge was a part of remaking man in God's image, which is precisely what the monastic life was supposed to be accomplishing and what it was all about. Now, depending on who you are and your point of view, so this could either sound rather quaint or rather alluring. But in many important aspects, actually, he foreshadows modern biblical studies. He's part of Latin Christendom. But unlike Augustine before him, or Aquinas after him, he read the New Testament in Greek and also learned Hebrew, and that set the pattern for the study of biblical languages. Indeed, Hugh actually seems to have single-handedly caused a mini revival in the study of biblical languages in the Middle Ages, which actually until very recently has gone pretty much unnoticed by the historians of the period. It's only recently we're starting to realize this. And now he's steeped in the church fathers, especially Origen and Augustine, and he made a habit of consulting the most recent commentaries. So it's not just going back all the way to the beginning, but also the recent commentaries and the most recent studies. His goal was shedding light on the literal sense of the text. Remember, Origen thought the literal sense of the text was fundamental as well, but he spent lots more time not on that, but on the allegorical interpretation, for which he is much more famous. Hugh is a bit skeptical about some of Origen's more wild and crazy allegories. Many of them just seem kind of arbitrary. But Hugh insists that history, of course, is fundamental for biblical interpretation, and that one should never rush into proposing allegorical meanings until basic historical questions have been answered. So for Hugh, those questions consist of things like the person, the business done, the time, the place, right? He tells us emphatically, do not think that you will be sensitive to allegory unless you have been first grounded in history, right? Dismissing history for an exegete is as fatal an error as a grammarian dismissing the mere alphabet. You can't do grammar if you don't have an alphabet with which to write, right? You can't play the philosopher right away before the hard, technical, heavy lifting is done. The sweating over what the text actually is saying in the Greek and Hebrew. So Hugh anticipated by centuries the much more historical theory of divine revelation embraced by Dei Verbum, that divine revelation is essentially both God's words and his deeds. Right, we'll see later an alternative vision of what divine revelation is. It depends less about God's words and deeds and more about doctrines and dogmas proclaimed by the church. But revelation is God's words and deeds. That is revelation. Now, Hugh insists that the Bible is not just words, but words that point to things. Things for Hugh are much more excellent and important than words. But why, right? Parallel words remain in the voice of men that perish, while things, once brought into being, last forever, hence the progression. So this progression of learning from the Bible that Hugh proposes, right? It begins with the words of the Bible, then proceeds to the concept attached to that word, and then from the concept to the things to which the word refers. And then we go from the things to the ideas abstracted from the things, and we end up finally from the ideas to the truth itself. Now, if this were a sort of different course, right, say one on metaphysics, we'd have a lot more to unpack here, right? But we're not doing a course on metaphysics, so we're not unpacking it, right? It's really an early attempt to unite the idealism of Plato, which is centered on forms that exist in the divine intellect, with the realism of Aristotle, which is centered upon things in the world. But that's not what we're doing. So, Hugh, of course, never advocates for a purely historical approach to the Bible. One reads the Bible not only for analysis, but also for moral living and practice of sound doctrine. So one must be a doer of the word and not merely a hearer. We need to take what the writer is saying seriously, but we also need to be able to actually put it into practice. Right? It's one thing not to understand, not to see what the writer himself thought, and another to stray from the rule of piety. If both of these things are avoided, the harvest of the reader is a perfect one. So, just as Vatican II states in Dei Verbum that when reading scripture, we have to be attentive to both what the author said and the analogy of faith and living tradition of the church. Here you have Hugh, almost 1,000 years beforehand, striking that same balance. So in a sense, he is way ahead of his time. Now, his influence should not be minimized. St. Bonaventure considered him the greatest mind in the church since Augustine. Right? This is before Aquinas, too. So indeed, Hugh is a watershed figure in the history of exegesis, for he begins a long line of commentaries and theologians who would turn their attention to the literal sense of the text, and all, of course, that entailed. Getting accurate texts, the study of the original languages, the Greek, the Hebrew, the grammar, and of course, rhetoric. So this is a movement that would only grow throughout the Middle Ages and, of course, into modernity. And we take for granted that if you're going to interpret the Bible, we start with the literal sense. And if you're really going to get serious about that, you read it in Greek or Hebrew, right? And not just in translation. So these trends that we see today even, owe a great deal to Hugh, and after him, of course, the biblical interpretation in the church would never be the same again. So Hugh of St. Victor is a watershed in the way that theology was studied both from before, right? Augustine's the one that you see throughout the Middle Ages, and then we see Hugh of St. Victor, and that leads into what we now know as scholasticism.